Welcome to our study of Mark's Gospel. Historically, Mark's Gospel has been viewed as the least important and perhaps the most dispensable of the four Gospels. For one thing, it's the shortest of the Gospels. It begins later in Jesus' life and ends earlier than the others. Indeed, almost 90% of Mark's Gospel is found in either Matthew or Luke, making some wonder whether it's even necessary to have this Gospel. Perhaps for this reason, it was the most neglected in the early church, and no commentary was written on Mark's Gospel until the 5th century. In many ways, Mark's is also the strangest of the four. There are many unusual episodes. Jesus repeatedly tells people to keep quiet about who he is and what he's done, something we call the Messianic Secret. Jesus' healings can also be strange. He spits in a deaf man's ears to make him hear, and spits in a blind man's eyes to make him see. At one point, Jesus only partially heals a blind man. The man can see people, but they're all blurry, walking around like trees, until Jesus fine-tunes the cure, and the man sees fully. Similarly, in Mark, Jesus' power seems limited at times. He goes to his hometown and gets a negative response from the townspeople. Mark writes that Jesus, quote, could not do many miracles there. Could not do miracles? Since when is the Son of God limited in his healing power? Then there are just some really bizarre episodes. For example, at the arrest of Jesus in Gethsemane, a young man who has not been seen before at all suddenly shows up. He's wearing only a linen shirt, and those arresting Jesus grab him, and he flees naked. This is quite odd. Finally, Mark's Gospel has an unusual ending. A group of women go to anoint Jesus' body and discover the empty tomb. There, an angel announces Jesus' resurrection. But the women are terrified and flee from the tomb. They tell nobody anything. End of story. Very strange. Yet while Mark's Gospel may be viewed as the strangest of the Gospels, most scholars today consider it to be the earliest of the Gospels, and so the closest to the actual events. This has made it the topic of intense study in recent years. Mark's Gospel is also the most dramatic of the Gospels. Mark is a master storyteller. He loves colorful details and vivid explanations. For example, Matthew will tell a story in 100 words. Mark will take 400 words to tell the same story and fill it with drama and color. The deeper you dive in Mark's Gospel, the more you see that it is a literary masterpiece. It used to be that Mark was viewed as just a string of loosely connected traditions with no real theological or narrative cohesion. Now scholars realize it is a carefully crafted narrative with great literary and theological depth. I want to mention first some of the literary features of Mark's Gospel. Then in our next session, we'll discuss introductory questions like authorship, date, and place of writing. So let's look at some literary features, starting with language and style. Mark's Gospel is written in quite simple and basic Greek. It's actually one of the easiest books of the New Testament to translate for beginning Greek students, far less sophisticated than, say, Luke's Gospel. Mark's is also a gospel more of action than of words. Although Mark frequently refers to Jesus as a teacher, he records far less of Jesus' actual teaching than the other Gospels, and proportionally more of his miracles. Jesus is a man of action, and this action moves forward at a breathtaking pace. Mark is fond of the Greek word outhous, often translated immediately. This word propels the narrative along at breakneck speed. Mark also uses a Greek construction called the historical present, which uses present tense verbs to describe past action. This literary device pushes the narrative ahead in a lively, vivid manner. For example, Mark 4:36-38, if read in a literal way, would sound something like this. Leaving the crowd, they're taking him along with them in the boat. There is arising a fierce gale of wind. They're waking him up and saying to him, "Teacher, don't you care that we're drowning?" There's a vivid sense here, like an on-the-spot news reporter. As we'll see, Mark is also fond of a literary feature known as intercalation, or sandwiching. In intercalation, one episode begins and then is interrupted by another one. Only after the new episode ends does the original one conclude. And the two episodes mutually interpret one another. For example, Jesus goes into Jerusalem at his last Passover. On the way, he curses a fig tree because it doesn't have any fruit on it. That story pauses, and Jesus goes into the temple and clears the temple of money changers and sellers. The next day, the fig tree episode concludes as the disciples discover the tree has withered from its roots. The clearing of the temple is sandwiched between the beginning and the end of the fig tree episode, and the two stories mutually interpret one another. Together, they symbolize Israel's spiritual unfruitfulness and coming judgment against the nation. Mark uses this kind of sandwiching technique at least 5 or 6 times in his gospel. Another literary feature common in Mark's gospel is the use of triads, or groups of 3. For example, there are 3 boat scenes, 3 predictions of Jesus' death. 3 times Jesus discovers the disciples sleeping in Gethsemane after he told them to keep watch. 3 times Peter denies he knows Jesus. As we shall see, these triads are often related to the failure of the disciples, which is a major theme in Mark's gospel. Finally, let me summarize Mark's structure, or his plot line. You can basically divide Mark into 2 halves, with each half highlighting a key aspect of his presentation of Christ. The first half of the gospel focuses on Jesus as the mighty Messiah and Son of God. Jesus performs powerful miracles, demonstrating the authority of the Messiah. This first half of the gospel climaxes in Peter's confession in chapter 8, verse 29, as Peter declares that Jesus is the Messiah. From that point on, however, Jesus begins to predict his coming suffering and death. And the second half of the book, chapters 8 through 16, focus on the way of the cross. Mark's point is that Jesus is indeed the mighty Messiah and Son of God, but he fulfills the messianic role in a unique and surprising way, by suffering as an atoning sacrifice for sins. The theme verse of the gospel could be identified as Mark 10:45. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as an atoning sacrifice for sins. The whole of the gospel then becomes a call to discipleship, to be willing to take up your cross and follow him. In our next session, we'll talk about introductory questions related to authorship, date, and purpose in writing.